So, listen to this. Footballers get hated on for a million reasons, but not many experience the kind of abuse David Ginola got, let alone for such a dumb reason. Because you see, people hated him because he was too pretty. No matter how good he was on the pitch, and trust me, he was good. Cruyff even said he was the best on the planet. Still, people insisted that he was more interested in doing shampoo commercials rather than playing football. And I know a lot of you are probably thinking this is a non-issue, that something like this couldn't really affect his career, but what if I told you that it actually ended up ruining it? That thanks to all of this hate, most of the public was literally preying on his downfall, scrutinizing every one of his moves so intensely that once he actually made a mistake, they crucified him for it, calling him an assassin, claiming that he had single-handedly killed French football, making him public enemy number one and damn near forcing him into exile. Leaving France and never coming back, spending the rest of his career desperately trying to win back the trust of his people, only to be repeatedly humiliated, which ironically only led him to push himself further and further, eventually hitting a peak so impressive that he managed to take on Man United's treble-winning team all by himself and come out victorious, leaving Sir Alex Ferguson so shocked that to this day, he still can't stop talking about it. In fact, Ginola kind of made it a habit of surpassing expectations. I mean, right from the start. At 16, he was getting thrown out of Nice for being too short and skinny, but then, 1 year later, he was already getting his professional debut at another club, and 2 years after that, he was somehow winning the Toulon tournament with France's under-20s, beating the likes of Stoichkov to the Player of the Tournament award, convincing half of the country that he would be the leader of the new generation. And really, that belief only seemed to grow stronger in the year following the tournament, with Ginola somehow taking his team SC Toulon to a 5th place finish ahead of Marseille and PSG before running it back at the Toulon tournament, scoring 5 goals in the 4 matches he played, leading France to revalidate their title. At this point, pretty much any team in the country would have been delighted to sign him. It was a matter of picking between Monaco, Bordeaux or Marseille, so rightfully, Ginola picked Matra Racing, which most of you probably don't know about because, well, as much as it was supposed to have been this massive project sponsored by French billionaire Jean-Luc Lagardère, even signing the iconic Enzo Francescoli alongside Ginola, 2 years later the club had somehow been relegated, abandoned by Lagardère and left to fend off by itself, eventually collapsing under a pile of financial problems, rebranding and starting over in the amateur leagues, which, to be fair, did not stop Ginola from carrying them to the final of the French Cup that very same year, damn near securing the trophy with a goal in extra time, only to eventually get defeated regardless. But it's okay, right? Surely after getting himself into such a mess, Ginola would know better now and would make sure to sign for one of France's top clubs. Right? Well, no, he signed for Brest, precisely the only club in France that was just as unstable as Matra Racing, having gone from the best season in their history to being relegated to being back on top in the space of like 4 years, right before Ginola's arrival. So it shouldn't have been of any surprise when only 10 months after his arrival, despite finishing 11th, the club ended up being relegated due to their financial problems, which obviously only made things 10 times worse, and by December, the fans were invading the pitch in protest, not even realizing that a week later the club would fall into bankruptcy as well and end up being dissolved, leaving Ginola without a club once again. Thankfully, after that, Ginola finally got his head straight and signed for PSG, but even then, it has to be said, he did reject Marseille before signing for PSG, and that definitely wasn't the best decision considering Marseille would win the Champions League just a year later. But oh well, I guess at this point we'll take what we can get. After all, soon there will be bigger problems to deal with than not winning the UCL. Right upon arriving in Paris, even if Ginola seemed to have no problem earning the approval of their fans who are notoriously difficult to please, it would be a completely different story when it comes to his teammates. In fact, his relationship with Georges Weah, maybe the biggest name in the team, was so bad that according to their teammates the two didn't even shake hands. However, once they entered the pitch, no one could have guessed that they hated each other. In fact, they were so in sync that right on their first full season together, they led PSG to their 3rd ever French Cup title, left them a mere 4 points off of what would have been their 2nd ever league trophy, and even managed to complete their most successful European campaign ever, even beating Real Madrid in the process. Regardless, even if Ginola had won over the hearts of the Parisians, the same could not be said for the rest of France. The public's opinion of Ginola was very clear. They thought he was vain, arrogant, and self-centered. However, if you asked his teammates, the people who knew him, that's not the story you would get. Sure, sometimes Ginola could get a little caught up trying to balance his celebrity lifestyle and football, football, but he was a nice, easygoing guy who loved football and wanted nothing else but to win. In reality, the fans hated him because they envied him. They envied that everything seemed so easy for Ginola. He kicked the ball around and thousands cheered uncontrollably. He stepped onto the street and women gravitated towards him like a moth to a flame. He held a bottle of shampoo for 10 seconds on TV and a 6-figure check would arrive the next day. Life was too easy for Ginola. He was the man who had it all. And it's hard not to hate that man, especially when you're just an average Joe. As much as his pretty face was a blessing, it was also a curse because it stopped the fans from seeing him only as the one thing he dreamt of being, a footballer. And in November of 1993, he made one mistake. Had it been anyone else, the outrage would have probably lasted a week, but since it was Ginola, the most hated man in France, it lasted a lifetime. You see, France hadn't been to a World Cup since 1986, and now they needed at least a draw against Bulgaria in order to make it to the 1994 World Cup. The only problem was that Bulgaria squad was easily the greatest in the country's history, and so, just as the match was about to go into injury time, the result was still stuck at a 1-goal draw. As much as France went into the game thinking they would dominate Bulgaria, they were now scared for their lives. So, once Ginola won a free kick off to the right side of Bulgaria's box, everyone expected him to take the ball and keep it in the corner, running down the clock. But well, the beautiful thing about Ginola's game was that he never feared anything or nobody, and he never ever played ugly football. So, instead of doing that, he crossed into the box. The ball landed at the feet of a Bulgarian defender, and only a mere 16 seconds later, Kostadinov smacked in the goal that made it so the French would go 12 years without setting foot at the World Cup. It was an horrendous moment for French football, and not only was it easier to blame it all on Ginola, but clearly many had been waiting for a moment like this, so they could feel their hate for him was justified. France's manager Gérard Houllier was one of them. Even before this game, his relationship with Ginola was notoriously difficult. Just like many of the fans, Houllier seemed to think that his flashy play style was only a desperate attempt at being the center of attention, and that his tactical naivety was actually just a result of his lack of commitment to the team. In fact, Ginola even started a match against Bulgaria on the bench. Houllier didn't trust him enough to start him in a match that would decide whether or not he got sacked the next morning. In fact, I think knowing his job was on the line was what pushed Houllier to do what he did next. In the post-match interview, while most managers would calm everyone down, telling the public that there's no way Ginola could have known what would happen, instead, Houllier did not shy away from blaming Ginola, saying to the press, "With 30 seconds left, we got stabbed in the back. The referee already had the whistle in his mouth when it all happened. What Ginola did was a crime against the team. He sent a missile through the heart of French football. Our final hope died today, and he was the assassin." This statement was like grabbing Ginola by the neck and placing it in a guillotine, and God knows, the French don't think twice before pulling that lever. So the next day, the message in the papers was clear. Ginola was now known as the assassin of French football, and soon Houllier would banish him from the national team, all because of one mistimed cross. But you look back now and, well, his entire team was standing back. It wasn't like they were caught with their pants down. There were like 7 players who could have stopped that counterattack. Honestly, it should have never got to that point. The only reason they were so desperate for a draw in that final match was because 5 days before, they had allowed Israel to beat them 3-2 despite the fact they hadn't won a single one of their last 8 matches. Hell, Ginola even scored to put them in front, but once he was subbed off, they still somehow managed to lose that match in the final minute as well. What happened wasn't Ginola's fault. It was the result of a talented team that was mentally weak as they get. So weak that when the moment to face adversity arrived, they were quick to blame someone else and turn him into a scapegoat. As Ginola would say, "I was taught that football was a team game, so I asked myself, why do they blame me for the failure of an entire country? This question will haunt me for the rest of my life." Maybe the only silver lining Ginola was able to take away from all of this was the fact that after the match, Houllier did get sacked no matter how much he tried to divert everyone's attentions away from himself. But unfortunately, it was his assistant Aimé Jacquet who succeeded him, and as you may expect, he shared his same disdain for Ginola. Regardless, he did sort of revert his ban, calling him up for a few friendlies and qualifiers over the next 2 years. After all, next to Papaye Cantona, he was easily the biggest name in French football over that period. At the end of the year, he somehow took the French Player of the Year award even after all of that drama, which I genuinely cannot wrap my head around. The year after that, he took PSG to what was their second ever league title while taking home the Player of the Season award, and finally even managed to drag them to the Champions League semi-finals, defeating Barca, Real and Bayern, impressing the Spanish so much they began referring to him as El Magnifico. While Ginola was living easily the darkest time of his career, he was still somehow able to lead PSG to what was the greatest era in their history. It was an unbelievable achievement. However, the French public remained unfazed. 2 years later, no one had forgotten the events of that infamous day, and so, at the end of the season, feeling like an outcast in his own country, Ginola began looking for a way out. And once he did, his career was never the same again. First, because he would never be called up to the national team again, but most importantly, because he would hit a peak like never before in his life. Then, 28 years old, Ginola had the likes of Johan Cruyff, his childhood idol, calling him up daily. He was one signature away from joining Barcelona. However, Ginola would once again be unlucky. The Bosman ruling would only take place a few months later, and so, with Cruyff unable to find clubs for Stoichkov and Agi, Barcelona were prohibited from signing any more foreign players, and as the closing of the transfer market approached, PSG got more and more impatient, and not knowing what to do, Ginola followed the footsteps of his fellow countryman Cantona and fled to England looking for a new life. Once again, shocking everyone with his strange decision-making, rejecting Arsenal in favor of Newcastle because his father was a big fan of Kevin Keegan. They would pay a mere 2.5 million for his signing. It would turn out to be one of the greatest bargains in the history of the sport. That season, 61 players moved for a higher amount. I doubt even a handful of them managed to match Ginola's impact at Newcastle. When he arrived at training, as Keith Gillespie would say, back then we didn't get much coverage of French football. Some of us had no idea who he was. When we saw him for the first time, we were shocked. He looked like a movie star, shades on and everything. We said to each other, are they sure this guy's a footballer? But then, we saw him in training. And that's when they realized that indeed, they hadn't signed a mere footballer, they had signed a superstar. You see, Kevin Keegan's team were literally known as the entertainers, and if there was one thing Ginola was capable of doing, it surely was entertaining. After his first preseason match, the entire city was talking about him. By the end of August, he had already been named as the league's player of the month, and 15 matches into the season, Newcastle were 5 points clear on top of the table. They had only lost one match, and no one had scored more goals than them. Ginola was the best player in the country. However, this story doesn't have a happy ending either. After those 6 months in Avon, Newcastle began fading. Even if their lead had gotten as large as 12 points, from there on out it seemed to shrink with every match day, and with only 6 left, United took over, took the trophy, and Cantona snatched the award for Player of the Year right out of Ginola's hands. In the midst of all of this, Barcelona desperately tried to fix their mistake, offering Newcastle £6 million for Ginola, but Keegan told them the only way he'd leave Newcastle was if they broke the transfer record. Ginola pleaded with Keegan, telling him, if you were in my position at 29, you too would want to join one of the biggest clubs in the world. But Keegan told him he couldn't, that the fans were still mad at him for selling Andy Cole, that they would kill him if he sold him as well, which felt especially unfair once Keegan left the club midway through the season with no apparent reason, leaving Ginola to feel as if he had been stabbed in the back, especially considering that his successor, Kenny Dalglish, would not really see eye to eye with Ginola, leading him to call Barcelona, asking them to make one final attempt at signing him. But by then, Robson and Cruyff were gone, Van Gaal had taken over, and he had no interest in signing a 30-year-old. There was an offer to join Real, but after so many years dreaming of Barcelona, Ginola, who had always been a romantic, just couldn't get himself to do it. PSG wanted him back, but the idea of moving back to France seemed abominable. So instead, he shocked the world one final time, joining Tottenham, who back then were a relegation side. I'm sure watching his Newcastle teammates play in the Champions League while he fought to keep his team afloat was tough, and I'm sure that watching France win the World Cup without him over the next summer was a million times worse. But as Ginola once said, I'd speak to the supporters and they'd tell me, we're playing such bad football, but it's worth it to go to the stadium just to watch you, and that responsibility fueled me. And the next season, even with the arrival of George Graham, a manager most claimed would not tolerate his play style, Ginola played the greatest season of his career. Over that year, he was undisputably the most entertaining player in the country. Some say he was capable of performing miracles, and I don't know about you, but he did take 11th place Tottenham to a League Cup trophy and qualification to the UEFA Cup, which to me, to the PFA and the FWA, sounds like a real miracle, because even though that year United won the treble, even though Beckham placed second in the Ballon d'Or while Ginola settled for a mere nomination, when the time to name the Player of the Year arrived, it was Ginola who took both awards. No player outside the league's top two had ever won either. After taking the award, he made sure to say, "This is a testament to my dedication. To the people who say David is more focused on modeling than football, I have to say that isn't true. You can't be the Player of the Year at 32 if you're not focused on your job." In fact, even at that age, Cruyff still hailed him as the best player in the world. Regardless, 1 year later, Graham, who after all did dislike his playstyle quite a bit, sent Ginola packing. He was angry, the fans were angry, it was clearly unfair after all he had done, but there was nothing anyone could do. Ginola ended up joining Aston Villa, only to find out he was signed by the board against the wishes of the manager, who then used the excuse that Ginola was fat when the press asked him why the Frenchman wasn't playing, to which Ginola proceeded to score in the next match and take off his shirt, showing off his six-pack for everyone to see. That man was a lot of things, but he surely wasn't fat. And so, after a 7-match stint at Everton, Ginola retired at 35 and he never forgave Houllier. In fact, he would eventually be forced to sue his old manager, who doubled down on his claims in his autobiography, going as far as calling Ginola a bastard. All because of a misplaced cross.